On a cold December morning in the year 2000, while the rest of Texas prepared for Christmas, a dark plan was already breathing inside the walls of the John B. Connally Unit, one of the most secure prisons in the entire state. It was the kind of place built to keep men locked away forever, a place surrounded by razor wire, watchtowers, and concrete thick enough to swallow screams. Yet behind those walls lived 7 inmates who believed no cage could hold them. They were murderers, armed robbers, repeat offenders, men with nothing to lose and everything to gain by risking it all. These 7 prisoners would later become known as the Texas-7, the group responsible for the most shocking prison escape in modern American history. But their story didn't begin with gunfire or bloodshed. It began with silence. It began with patience. It began with men who had been studying the prison routines, memorizing guard rotations, and whispering to each other through the vents at night when the lights went out. They were building an idea that would soon turn into a violent storm. The leader of the group, George Rivas, was not just another inmate. He was intelligent, disciplined, and desperate. Already serving a life sentence with no chance of parole, Rivas had convinced himself that dying during an escape was better than rotting away behind bars. Around him stood 6 others: Joseph Garcia, Ronald Renfro, Randy Halprin, Larry Harper, Michael Rodriguez, and Patrick Murphy. Each had his own story, his own crimes, his own demons. But together, they formed something deadly, something organized, determined, and fearless. For months they watched the prison staff. They studied their weaknesses, their habits, their blind spots. They noticed which guards were easily distracted, which ones walked alone, which ones complained about holiday workload and would be mentally exhausted as Christmas approached. It was all information, and information inside a prison was more valuable than any weapon. December 13th, 2000. The day everything changed. The sun barely warmed the yard that morning, and the cold air made every breath heavy. The inmates acted calm, but their hearts pumped like engines under their uniforms. They spent the day working labor jobs inside the unit, cleaning, unloading supplies, fixing equipment. And then, somewhere between one locked door and another, they made their move. It started in the maintenance area. A guard was sent there alone. He didn't expect anything unusual. He didn't even realize the 7 inmates had slowly gathered, timing their movements so naturally that it almost looked accidental. But when the guard turned his back, everything turned dark. They jumped him, wrestled him to the ground, covered his mouth, and tied him up. His radio was taken, his keys confiscated. He stayed silent because one wrong sound could have cost him his life. With one guard down, the momentum shifted. The inmates spread out, disguising themselves as maintenance workers, using stolen jackets and stolen confidence. They moved quickly, using their knowledge of the building to outsmart a system believed to be unbreakable. They took down another guard. Then another. By the time officers realized something was wrong, the Texas-7 had staged a full-scale internal takeover. One guard was dragged into a closet. Another was forced to lie face down with his hands bound behind his back. Radios were stolen, guns were stolen, and the inmates walked through the facility like shadows that no one could stop. The prisoners used the guards' equipment to communicate through the radios, pretending to be officers. It was chaos, but controlled chaos. They were acting out a script they had rehearsed in their heads for months. The scariest part? It worked. Almost too well. Eventually they reached the parts of the prison that connected to the world outside, the warehouse loading dock. It was the weak spot, the vulnerable artery of the prison, the place where real-world goods came inside and where they hoped their freedom would begin. A civilian truck driver had just pulled up, expecting to unload his cargo. Instead, he found himself staring at the barrels of stolen guns. He was restrained, robbed, and used as leverage as the 7 inmates prepared to flee. Everything happened fast. The inmates loaded tools, clothes, food, and whatever they could steal into the prison maintenance truck. The warehouse workers were locked in a small room, gagged and terrified. Radio chatter from confused guards started building. Officers began to sense something was wrong. But by then it was already too late. The Texas-7 drove straight out of the Connally Unit gates in a stolen truck, passing security with the confidence of real maintenance staff. There was no Hollywood explosion, no dramatic shootout, no alarms screaming through the air, just a quiet exit from a place that had never lost control like this before. The prison didn't realize the full extent of the disaster until the group was miles away. When the discovery finally hit the officers, panic spread through the facility. The warden ordered a total lockdown. Every hallway filled with shouting guards and handcuffed inmates. Radios crackled with emergency commands. The state of Texas activated every available law enforcement unit. Helicopters, patrol cars, federal teams, and local officers all began hunting 7 dangerous escapees who had vanished into the winter horizon. Meanwhile, the Texas Seven were speeding north, laughing, breathing, tasting freedom for the first time in years. But freedom, for them, was only temporary. They knew every police department in the state would be after them. They knew the FBI would get involved. They knew running wasn't enough. They needed money, weapons, and a way to disappear. So they traveled like ghosts. They hit small towns. They stole clothes from stores. They disguised themselves. They camped in abandoned buildings. They broke into homes when homeowners weren't around. They used fake names, fake stories, fake smiles. For the first few days, their escape was almost unbelievable. Newspapers called them dangerous. News stations repeated their names every hour. Their mugshots spread across Texas like wildfire, printed in black and white with headlines that made the public shiver. But the Texas Seven didn't just want to hide. They wanted to survive. And survival required money. A lot of it. That need would soon lead them to a tragedy that cemented their place in American criminal history. 4 days after Christmas, December 24, 2000, while families prepared for holiday dinners, the Texas Seven pulled into the parking lot of an Oshman sporting goods store in Irving, Texas. Inside that store were guns, ammunition, and thousands of dollars in cash. It was everything they needed to prolong their escape. They planned the robbery carefully, watching the customers and employees. They waited until the store felt quiet. Then they walked in. The robbery began smoothly. They tied up employees and forced the store manager to open the safe. They loaded weapons into bags, stuffing them with the kind of firepower that could keep them running for months. But the moment everything seemed under control, fate twisted in the worst way possible. A call went out, an alarm, silent but deadly. The Irving Police Department responded without hesitation. Officer Aubrey Hawkins, a young father working late on Christmas Eve, arrived first. He thought he was responding to a simple robbery. What he didn't know was that he was walking into an ambush set by 7 desperate men with stolen guns and nothing left to lose. As Officer Hawkins pulled into the parking lot, gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped through the night, through his patrol car, through his body. The Texas Seven unloaded an avalanche of gunfire, dozens of rounds, killing him instantly. The violence was overwhelming, fueled by panic and raw determination to escape again. The officer never had a chance. When backup arrived, the group was already gone, leaving behind a scene so horrific that investigators were speechless. The killing of Officer Hawkins transformed the escape from a dangerous manhunt into a national emergency. The FBI placed the Texas Seven on their 10 most wanted list. Their faces were now everywhere: airports, bus stations, TV screens, newspapers, even billboards along Texas highways. The entire country knew who they were. And the entire country wanted them stopped. For weeks, the Texas Seven moved across different states, disguising themselves as church volunteers, construction workers, even traveling missionaries. But every mile they traveled brought them closer to the one truth they couldn't escape: they were running out of time. They argued. They panicked. They changed locations constantly. The weight of what they had done, especially the murder of Officer Hawkins, hung over them like a storm cloud. And that storm finally broke in January 2001. Someone recognized them. Someone made the call. Law enforcement surrounded their hideout in Colorado. The Texas Seven tried to run once more, but it was no longer a prison escape, it was a collapse. A desperate ending to a desperate journey. Some surrendered. One took his own life. Others were captured after tense standoffs. The escape was over. But the story, their story, had only just begun. Because once they were back in custody, the consequences of their actions would fall on them with full force, especially for the murder that shocked Texas and the entire nation. And that terrible chapter begins next. The capture of the Texas Seven didn't begin with sirens or gunfire. It began with fear that slowly ate away at the group as winter tightened around them. After the murder of Officer Aubrey Hawkins, the escapees suddenly realized they weren't just wanted men anymore. They were hunted men. Their faces were on every news broadcast. Their mugshots glared from gas station windows. Their names were repeated so often that even children whispered them like characters from a nightmare. For weeks, the group drifted north, leaving Texas behind and slipping into Colorado. They pretended to be harmless Christian missionaries, using stolen IDs and fake smiles to blend into a quiet RV park near the small town of Woodland Park. They attended church services. They volunteered. They shook hands and bowed their heads in prayer, all while hiding guns, cash, and a growing sense of dread. But even disguises have cracks. On January 20th, 2001, one of the members, Michael Rodriguez, walked into a convenience store and caught the attention of a man who thought he looked familiar. The man went home, saw a news report, and froze. The face on the screen matched the man he had seen hours earlier. Without hesitation, he called the police. That single decision would bring the entire empire of the Texas-7 crumbling down. Within hours, law enforcement moved in. The RV park where the group was hiding turned from a peaceful retreat into a battlefield waiting to erupt. The FBI, local police, SWAT teams, everyone surrounded the area with silent precision. Floodlights lit up the cold night. Officers positioned themselves behind trees, vehicles, and snow-covered rocks. Helicopters hovered overhead like mechanical predators. Inside the RV, the Texas-7 felt the shift in the air. They heard the distant hum of engines. They sensed the eyes watching them from the darkness. Panic spread silently among them. Some whispered plans to fight. Others whispered prayers. All knew that this moment, this night, was the end of their run. Then the voice boomed over the loudspeaker. "Come out with your hands up." Silence followed. The 7 men looked at each other, each wrestling with his fate. Surrender, fight, die. The choices were small but heavy. After a long moment, George Rivas, the leader, made his decision. He stepped outside, hands raised, trembling from cold and fear. Officers tackled him, cuffed him, dragged him away. One by one, more members followed: Garcia, Halprin, Murphy, Rodriguez. Each emerged from the shadows looking thinner, colder, and older than when they had escaped. But not all of them chose surrender. Larry Harper, one of the more unpredictable members of the group, refused to be taken alive. Instead of walking outside, he locked himself inside the RV and pressed a gun to his head. Officers tried negotiating. They pleaded. They shouted. They waited. But Harper said nothing. A single shot echoed through the camp, ending his life instantly. The escape that began with silent planning ended with a silent death. By sunrise, the Texas-7 had fallen. The long, terrifying chapter of their escape was over. But the next chapter, the one that would define their legacy, was waiting inside a courtroom. Back in Texas, the trials drew huge crowds. Families of victims sat shoulder to shoulder with reporters. Officers testified. Survivors from the robbery testified. Former guards from the Connally Unit described the fear they felt when the group tied them up, stole their radios, and walked out of the prison like ghosts. But the loudest presence in the room was always the memory of Officer Aubrey Hawkins, the young father who had been murdered on Christmas Eve. It didn't take long for prosecutors to build their case. Texas law allows a charge called law of parties, meaning that if a group commits a felony and someone dies, even if one person pulled the trigger, everyone involved can be sentenced equally. The Texas-7 fell directly under that rule. Every man who stepped into Oshman's Sporting Goods that night was held responsible for the officer's death. The jury didn't hesitate. Guilty, guilty, guilty. One verdict after another. One sentence after another. Death. 6 of the remaining escapees were sentenced to die by lethal injection. The courtroom stayed cold and quiet as each man heard his fate. Some tried to look emotionless. Some cried. Some bowed their heads as if accepting the weight of their choices. None could escape what was coming. In the years that followed, their executions came one by one. George Rivas was executed first in 2012. Joseph Garcia followed. Michael Rodriguez had even asked to speed up his own execution, accepting it as punishment for what they had done. Each execution reopened wounds for Officer Hawkins' family, but also brought a sense of closure that the law had been fulfilled. Some members, like Patrick Murphy and Randy Halprin, still fought their cases, arguing legal issues and religious bias claims. Court battles continued, appeals were filed, and judges reviewed transcripts again and again. But no matter how many motions were filed, the shadow of their crimes never left them. The story of the Texas Seven became a dark symbol in American criminal history, a reminder of how far desperation can push a person and how quickly a clever plan can collapse under the weight of violence and consequence. Their escape forced Texas prisons to change procedures, tighten security, and reevaluate how inmates worked inside prison units. But beyond the policies and headlines, the story remains deeply human. 7 men believed they could outsmart the system. For a moment, they did. But freedom built on blood cannot last. Choices driven by fear and desperation eventually circle back, and when they do, they hit harder than any wall or razor wire. Today, the name, the Texas Seven, still carries a dark echo. Their faces still appear in documentaries, crime books, and late-night investigations. And every time the story is told, people remember the victims who paid the price, especially the officer who never made it home on Christmas Eve. The escape is history now, but the impact remains. A story of men who ran from prison and straight into the unforgiving hands of fate.